should be able to view them. I think Safa shared the marks for her section already, but I've put them up officially. The people who were absent from the quiz have been given a slightly lower mark than the class average. They can't be given their own average because there are only 2 quizzes. So anyway, that's a little bit about logistics. Now let's begin. So today what we want to talk about is a continuation a little bit of what we discussed last time, which was, what is the self and what are the factors that comprise the psychological construct of the self as we define it. And in that context, we talked about the self-esteem of a person, the self-concept, the self-efficacy. So, self-efficacy as in how competent you think you are, self-concept, like who you think you are, what are your beliefs and your values, and your self-esteem is basically how much you value your beliefs and your values and your abilities, right? So sort of like, what is your sense of self-worth? And we discussed the theory of identity development that was posed by Erikson as inspired by Freud's notion of a conflict occurring at each developmental stage as well. And within that, then, we sort of saw that there are multiple factors, of course, that comprise of who you are in terms of the ways in which your environment contributes to your values and your beliefs and your attitudes is very varied. And at the same time, we also saw that culture has a big role within that environment, right? So we talked a little bit about how norms and values can impact your self-esteem as well, but also really shape the way that you think about the world and how you value those thoughts that you have about the world. Now, the last sort of thing I want to talk about insofar as the self is concerned is 2 predominant sort of, let's call them forms of culture. So broadly defined, right? We talk about culture as having individualism or collectivism. And those refer very much to a social way of being. And because they are a social way of being, they have a massive impact on how we define ourselves, how we value those traits within ourselves. And so there's this really convenient table that's in your book, and it's also on a slide if you want to refer to that. I think I've uploaded these. So when we talk about ourself, in individualist cultures, the value that is placed on the self is that the self should be independent, not in a codependent or mutually dependent relationship of any kind, in the sense that the self is independent of what the collective wants or what the community wants or what the community needs. So in this sort of a culture, the priority is given to your own values, your own beliefs, and your own needs. And so your identity is not derived from the culture or the people around you. It's very much about what you believe as an independent being and not how those beliefs affect other people, right? On the other hand, when we talk about collectivism, we are talking about an interdependent culture. So in collectivist cultures, we're talking about how your beliefs affect other people and the extent to which other people are part of your beliefs. And so a large part of your values, for example, will be such that place a high priority on others. And so you're very interdependent in your existence, right? Your values, your beliefs, your attitudes are all very interdependent and are derived also largely from the community that you're part of, right? Small example could be that if you live in a neighborhood that is within an independent, individualistic society, it's unlikely that you will really know all of your neighbors, or that you will, if somebody's having a wedding, you won't be invited to their house. But in our society, If you think about just where you live, you're likely to know many, if not all, of your neighbors. You're likely to kind of, go over in times of grief, and share times of happiness, so on and so forth. So there's very interdependent sharing sort of culture when we talk about collectivist cultures, and that is the influence that it has on the self. And so in an individualistic society, of course, the focus, because it's so much on who you are, right? Your identity is so independent that you have to kind of discover who you are, and you have to, there's a little bit of focus on how unique you are. Whereas in a collectivist society, it's more about the way that you relate to people and to the people around you. You're more concerned with what happens in other people's lives, right? And to be there for other people and to support other people. And it's very much about, the greater good rather than the individual good when we're talking about a collectivist society. But in an individualist society, it's about your personal goals and your personal wish fulfillment and your personal sort of life journey, which is, again, I'll emphasize, independent of anybody around you. And so the way that you deal with that is that you grow up sort of thinking that you have the capacity, or you should be able to change your reality to suit your goals, because your goals are the predominant element, or your goals have priority. On the flip side, in a collectivist culture, it's very much about accommodating or adjusting to that collective reality, because you are not able to shape your own, right? Your reality is derived by the group's reality. Um, and so your sort of value, a large part of it comes from, like I said, the way you connect to people. And so even your moral reasoning will be derived from this sense of for the greater good. Okay. And I'll remind you, when we studied evolutionary psychology, we talked a little bit about the universal fairness principle. Do you remember that? Or sorry, it was universal moral grammar, in relation to the fairness principle, where this study was replicated in an individualist society and in a collectivist society. And even though in the collectivist society, the proportion of money that was shared was much lower, tended to be lower or more varied also than the money that was shared between the study participant and the external in an individualist society. And the reason for that is, we realized, is because collectivist societies tend to function on principles of reciprocity, right? You take care of your neighbor and your neighbor's going to take care of you. And so even if you don't make that financial exchange at a very high level, it's okay if you don't give your neighbor more money, because you'll have other opportunities to share with them and to be there for them and to give to them. But in an individualistic society, the opportunities for these exchanges are very limited. Everybody is basically in their own bubble, responsible for their own needs, for their own demands. And if they want to fulfill those demands, that's their job. That's not the community's job. That's not the job of society at large, right? Um, and so I'm guessing that my description of collectivist culture is probably reminding you very much of the culture that you exist in, which would be fair and accurate because, well, that is what it is. And so, for instance, for us in our culture, in our society, it's important for us to, maintain kinship, relationships, and be there for extended family and this and that. And we are also, in terms of our friendships, we value them. We have quite a few. We maintain these sort of familial bonds even with our friends. But in individualistic societies, those kinds of relationships are not as widespread. You don't really have this much of an effort that goes into these sorts of close relationships. So you'll have many relationships, but they won't have the same sort of depth that you would see in a collectivist society, because again, we're so tightly knit, right? And so finally, the ways in which people behave in individualistic societies is that you are held accountable for your own actions, and you can act in whatever way according to your own values, your beliefs, and your attitudes, which, remember, are derived from an independent perspective, independent of people at large. And then the second thing is that in a collectivist society, on the other hand, your behavior is going to reflect what is acceptable to the people within the community or within the society that you exist in. And this, obviously, neither of these extremes is ideal, right? Because we understand that human beings want support, we want some depth, we need some depth in our relationships, we need to feel connected. In fact, one of the principles of positive psychology, if you can remember, is a sense of belonging. And when you don't have that sense of belonging, you can sort of spiral and you can feel unhappy. And I don't know. I mean, I can tell you a little bit like my experience when I have a few friends who are American, and I have a few friends who are German, and they're very close friends. But it's really interesting that the way in which I perceive the friendship is very different from the way in which they perceive the friendship. So, for instance, often we would meet for dinner, and I would just take something with me, because that's very much a cultural thing for us, that you don't go to somebody's house empty-handed, right? And so I would maybe cook something or pick up some dessert and always just take something. And they were so blown away by that. And the second thing that they found really sort of, I think, a little fascinating was the fact that, I would like ask them questions about their family and get to know their parents and their siblings. And that's just not something that is really common to Western cultures. You know, you don't exactly relate to the family of your friends much in the same way that you do over here. Over here, you'll go to the cousin's wedding also, and you'll go to like the sister's dance practice also, and you just kind of engage with the entire family and not just your friend, right? And so that's some small example of how to express the difference in those two societies, right? So in a collectivist society, if you're sick, somebody's gonna get you something, right? I lived in an apartment and I met my neighbors once. Like, we had a conversation once, right? And this is the thing, like, you have many relationships, but they're temporary, and they usually are like, oh, hello, good morning, how are you? I'm fine, how are you? I'm fine, bas, khatam. But over here, it's like, oh, how are you? Oh, this happened, and then that happened, and then I didn't have power, and then I need this, and I don't have petrol in my car, and some random stranger will stop and help me. That doesn't happen in societies that value the independence of just the individual, right? But in our society, the value that is most highly valued is interdependence. And that has a defining element on how you see yourself and how you value that self that you see, right? It's fairly straightforward. We have a question: do some people in a collectivist society likely to lead an individualist lifestyle, and does the collectivist society call them deviant for their preferences? Yes. And the same thing would happen on the flip as well. And it's not necessarily called deviant, right? Because I mean, you may adopt certain individualistic values and you may still maintain certain collectivist values, because the older you get, the more able you are to make those choices and to, with awareness, decide what parts of your beliefs or attitudes or values need to be done away with, and what parts need to stay with you, and what are certain new sort of ways of looking at the world that you want to incorporate in your life, right? So just a small example could be the way in which the world is changing for you as young people is very different from the way the world changed for me when I was your age. It didn't really, to be honest, but for you guys, that sort of, so there's a social awareness that did not exist 10 years ago. Okay, an increased, heightened social awareness, or I would call it like almost a social consciousness, okay, about the intention of the language that we use, for example, right? Why we don't want to use certain adjectives to describe certain types of people anymore. That's a very small example, but for somebody my age, what that means is revisiting, let's say, long held sort of ways of speaking or ways of being, and realizing that some of those are problematic, and then making that conscious decision to let them go, right? So, self identity, who you are, yes, it can become stagnant, but it also can be adaptive and flexible. And that depends on the degree of openness that you have within your personality traits, right? So if you're open to new experience, if you're open to new information, you are likely to continue to flex and change. Okay? But the lower openness you have, the lower openness to change that you have, the more likely you are to stay where you're at because it's comfortable, it's safe, and it's familiar. Now, we're going to talk more about the self when we eventually discuss personality. So you can ask any questions you have about those sort of micro level influences when we talk about that. But broadly speaking, this is just meant to give you a sense of, well, identity is very complex. The factors that shape identity are very complex. And the way that you see yourself is not necessarily the way that other people see you. And that's something that is important because sometimes we are acting in ways that are contrary to the beliefs we hold, and we're not extremely comfortable, and we're not sure why, and the why is cognitive dissonance. And sometimes paying attention to other people's perspectives about oneself can help you figure out where the problem is. If someone's perception of who you are is very different from who you think you are, what your self-concept is, that's a very useful opportunity to think about if your behaviors and your actions are reflective of your actual values and beliefs, right? So any sort of feedback, I feel, is always like an opportunity for growth. So we're done now with developmental psychology, and we're going to start with consciousness, sensation, and perception today. So lots of big stuff. If you remember, okay, so I'm gonna take a pause for a quick second, and I want to ask you. Actually, I need to switch internet connections. Sorry, 1 second. All right. So I wanted to ask you before we begin this consciousness and sensation perception, what do you think it means to be conscious? Does it mean just to be awake? Or can you have more consciousness during your awakening or less? Who has their hand raised? Go ahead.
Yes, Miss. Hi, this is Jyoti. So, what I think is complete consciousness is that you're aware of your surroundings and you actually remember what happened and what is happening. You're actually perceiving the moment. You're understanding it, and you understand and you can comprehend and you actually can recall it in the future.
Yeah, so you're interpreting with awareness whatever is happening
Yes.
around you. Rania?
Miss, I think consciousness can also depend upon the type of issues you're educated on, and when you observe society, how you're able to integrate that information into the relationships that people have with each other, and how they perform their identity with other people and with society as a larger structure.
So society as a larger structure, and also how you take what you've understood and what you've observed and understood from what you've observed, and then apply that in your interactions, in your relationships. That's one. I would say that's one part of consciousness. Um, yeah, but remember, we're talking about a psychological construct, right? So yes, it's one part of your consciousness is your observation, interpretation of social relationships, and how you then take all of that and put it in your own relationships, the way that you interact with people. There are a couple of things on chat right now. Let me just quickly read through them. So many things. Fully aware of our surroundings, to be aware of your surroundings, aware of what you are thinking and doing, acknowledge the things around you, the awareness of your awareness, aware of yourself as well as surroundings, to be able to comprehend your thoughts, communicate them, to be present, alert, have the ability to make sense of your surroundings, aware of yourself and your surroundings. One can possibly mean more aware. One can, what? No. Can possibly mean be more aware of the world around you, but can also mean to be able to understand what you understand. I'm not sure what that means. Having awareness about your surroundings. Okay, can you say something different if somebody, all right. To be aware of your external situation, your feelings, your thoughts, in touch with your inner state, as well as perceptive about your environment. To be in touch with your inner state and perceptive about the environment. Can you really separate? I want you to think about it. Connect to introspection and metacognition, yes. Being aware of your thoughts. And okay, I'm going to stop now. Everybody's just saying the same thing. So if you recall, introspection was something that Wilhelm Wundt wanted to examine, right? And he wanted to see how our awareness impacts our reactions and how aware we are when we, how many of our responses are basically reflexive and we don't really do them with consciousness. For example, right now, as I'm teaching you, you probably noticed I use hand gestures a lot when I'm communicating, right? The minute I started thinking of an example of showing you how something can be done during a time of awakening, but without conscious awareness of it, is basically this that I do, right? This is a very completely unconscious sort of mechanism that just is a part of my body language. But the minute I started thinking of an example, now I can't stop thinking about how my hands are moving. So it's like I'm doing the same thing that I do unconsciously, in the sense of without awareness, without actual awareness of the motion. But now the minute I'm thinking about it, I'm bringing it into my awareness, and so now I'm observing it, right? So that's sort of a little small example of what Wundt went. But now when we kind of go back into history, we see that, poor Wilhelm Wundt, he had this really brilliant idea, but he didn't have the resources, the technology to explore it. And so almost 100 years later is when this notion of consciousness comes back into importance, because it was overtaken by the behaviorists. It was sort of set aside by the functionalists, because all of that was, so the functionalists were looking at us as adaptive species, at the brain as an organ, right? It's very biological, deterministic sort of almost sometimes point of view. The behaviorists, on the other hand, are focusing just on what they can see, right? Observable behavior. And they're not looking at the mental life of a person. And then you see this shift back into, well, what are the processes of human thought, right? What is memory? What is responsible for actual communication? What is speech, right? How do we think about the world? So with that focus coming back to cognition, people start talking about consciousness again. And consciousness in a scientific context, not as defined by Freud. Okay, Freud's unconscious is something that has yet to be scientifically proven. So forget about his definition right now for our purpose. Unconscious refers to the motions, the reflexes that occur naturally within you without you thinking about them. And consciousness refers to your awareness, absolutely, of yourself and your environment, which so many of you have said, you're right. But that awareness that you have of your environment and yourself is also defined by your lived experiences. Okay? we are not going to have the same awareness even if we're in the same environment. Okay, the way that we are going to interpret ourselves and our environment is going to vary widely, right? So right now there are about, I don't know, 71 people in this Zoom classroom. Okay, each of us is understanding this particular online environment differently based on our prior lived experiences as well as who we are. It's a combination, and that is our conscious awareness, right? Our subjective awareness. Each person has their own perspective on what is happening right now, right? And so that's one piece of it. And the reason that I said to you earlier that we look at the scientific element of consciousness is because we're looking at consciousness as well. You know, what enables me to drive a car, right? Like, what is it that enables me to drive a car where so many of my emotions, once I've driven a car for, let's say, a year even, a lot of my emotions, like the brake or when to use the handbrake or when to accelerate, right? All of those things become muscle memory. I don't even think about them, they just happen. At the same time, I can talk to somebody, not text because that's dangerous, and not talk on the phone like this because that's dangerous. We don't do that, it's bad behavior. But let's say you can have a phone call with someone on Bluetooth, you can have a passenger in your car, you can have a conversation with them, you can even glance over and look at them occasionally, not too often, but just occasionally. And you can, while you're doing all of that, still maneuver this machine, pay attention to cars around you, hopefully not bang into anything. This is why you never want to have a fight with somebody when you're driving, because it will completely mess up your attention. Okay, this is something important within consciousness. Consciousness, our subjective awareness, it enables us to selectively pay attention to certain things that we are most focused on, right? So that's why I said don't have a fight with someone when you're driving, because when you do that, then your attention becomes focused on that emotional heightened state, on that conversation, and you are unable then to really drive safely, right? So that's something to consider. Consciousness, studying consciousness also helps us understand this really interesting thing that we all do, which is called inattentional or change blindness. Okay, and this is something that I find really fascinating because I think it often happens to me. But you know, have you ever looked for something like your keys and they're right in front of you, and you look everywhere and you look in that place where they are right in front of you as well, and you look 15 times and you just don't see them? Happens, right? So we're so focused on just like locating these keys and we just don't see them. And you know how people sometimes have their glasses right up on their head and they're like, oh, I haven't been able to find my glasses. I don't know where my glasses are. That's inattentional blindness. It's just a little tiny malfunction in our consciousness where we focus so much on the process of locating that we forget about observing, right? So again, inattentional blindness, change blindness. Now, within psychology, we talk about consciousness, but we understand that consciousness has different forms of existence. We call them states of consciousness. And in any given day, you can move from one state to another state to another state. I mean, even in this class, you could find yourself in this state of complete attention to the lecture, and then you could go off into daydreaming, right? Um, and then you could kind of come back here, and then you could start feeling hungry, and then you could come back here, right? So your consciousness, it varies. um, and while it would be really easy if we said, okay, oh, you're only conscious when you're awake, that's not true. What we know now, although that was the original belief, to be aware, you have to be awake, right? But now we know that's not the case. And actually, even when you're asleep, you are on some level continuing to process, right? So think about patients who are in comas, you sense brain activity even there, right? So wherever there's brain activity, you have to detect some level of consciousness, right? Because there is still some awareness. So again, that's why, when somebody gave the example of social conscious, what I interpreted as social consciousness, like being aware of norms, values, etc., and then like observing those and then applying those to your relationships, that's not all it is. Because when you're asleep, you're not aware exactly. I mean, let's say you can't, when you're sleeping, you don't think about what you're observing, but you are still observing, you're still feeling, you're still sensing, you're still perceiving, right? So while you're sleeping, you can be asleep, right? But if you feel cold in your sleep, you're going to pull this blanket over you, yes or no? There is still some awareness, right? So while one element is very much about your lived experience and all of that within consciousness, the other element is also about how we just kind of work with our environment, right? Um, and so we want to focus on consciousness as something that we study within cognition, okay? And if you remember again, cognition is all the thought structures of processes responsible for thinking, for remembering, for speaking, communicating, for learning. So when we think about it in that way, this is, sorry, I saw the chat box. So when you put it in that perspective, then when we talk about consciousness, we want to talk about also sensation and perception, right? So how do you, when you touch, let's say, uh, when you touch something cold, how do you know that it's cold, right? So the touch itself is sensation, and then understanding it to be cold is perception, okay? And that's something we do sometimes, yes, with awareness, like with the proper, like a thought about it. And sometimes it's like so quick we don't even register it. But most of the time it's so quick we don't even register it. It's like, when you're walking, um, you kind of don't really think about it. But if you're looking at the ground, while you're looking at the ground, if you see like a pothole in front of you, your feet just go the other way. Hopefully you don't trip. Your feet just go the other way and you just cross it and you move forward, right? It's something that's so quick, it's so automatic. But that is your sensation and perception at work, right? You can, like I said, you can be reading something or talking to someone and you can still navigate through a crowd of people, right? And you're not even thinking about that navigation. You're just having your conversation, you're having your coffee, you have it in your hand, whatever, you're walking around. What is that? How are we able to do these things? How are we able to walk into a room and find a chair to sit on? How are we able to walk into a crowded room and spot a friend immediately? These are things that are part of our consciousness and are enabled by your ability for sensation perception. Sense perception is one of the biggest things that we use to understand consciousness. But obviously, we also think a little bit about memory, and we think about cognition, metacognition, rather, thinking about your thinking, which is absolutely a big part of consciousness as well. And consciousness is really fascinating, right? And so, this example that I gave you, that you can be talking to somebody and moving through a crowd, that's called parallel processing, right? So on a conscious level is your conversation that you're having, And also on a conscious level is you're looking at the crowd around you. So you know कि सामने खड़ा है कोई, so you have to go left or you have to go right. And your legs are just automatically moving in those directions. Your body is just automatically doing that, right? That's parallel processing. Multiple processes happening at the same time that essentially allow you to, well, function, right? And this is, we also call it dual processing. So it's basically like you have unconscious information happening. So your vision is another thing that can be called an unconscious process, because you see things and you see them as they are, but they're so okay. We'll talk a little bit about sensation perception. There are particular elements that allow you to see, right? Just to see, just the biology of it. That information that you receive through your eyes and your retinal lens, etc., gets communicated to your brain, which is called bottom-up processing. And then through top-down processing, what happens is that your brain, the visual cortex, yeah, it translates that information and tells you that, oh, you are actually looking at a computer screen right now. Simple. Parallel processing, bottom up, top down, split second. You don't even know it's happening. You don't even, quite literally, you don't even think about it, right? So that was my little segue into sensation perception. But coming back to consciousness, when you remember I said that even when you're asleep, you have some level of consciousness. And the reason for that is simple, because there is brain activity. Where there is brain activity, there is consciousness, because there is thought, right? And when somebody doesn't have brain activity at all, what do we call that? We call that brain death. Okay. So even when you're asleep, you have consciousness, but there are different sort of levels of consciousness, or let's say different levels of activity at different cycles of your sleep, or different stages of your sleep, whatever you prefer. And so when you're in your deepest sleep, right, your deepest sleep, even then you have a certain level of consciousness. So when you, for example, are dreaming, what is that? The dreaming happens when you are in a stage of sleep called REM sleep. No, faster waves. When you're dreaming, you have faster brain waves, because your brain is doing a lot of so visualization, a lot of storytelling basically happening in your brain during your dreaming. But when you're relaxed, whether you're awake or asleep, when you're in a state of relaxation, let's say you're having like a really, like you're meditating, right? That's a good example. When you're meditating or you're practicing mindfulness, you're going to have brain waves that are slower, because you're calming everything down, right? You're suppressing and just sort of putting a pause on everything. But that doesn't mean your brain activity stops. It just means it slows down, right? And when your brain activity speeds up again, it's fast, right? So just something to think about. We call it a waking beta or alpha. When we have beta waves, we talk about more activity. Alpha waves demonstrate lower activity. Aisha, go ahead.
Okay, Assalamu alaikum, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes, welcome salam.
Ma'am, I want to ask that when we panic and like जब हमारी brain activity increase हो जाती है due to anything, when we are in stress or any stuff, so we usually take deep breaths ताकि something that we are unable to recall, हमें वो recall हो. So if brain activity actually slows down when we take deep breaths and meditate, so how does it help us to, memorize, to recall stuff and to, हमें अपनी memory recall कैसे होती है फिर उस time पे?
Because what you do is when you do that, what you just described, what you're actually doing is that you are starting to create a space for selective attention, right? So you get rid of all the excess extra activity. So for example, one part of doing that is maybe you close your eyes, okay? So you're shutting down all of that data that you would otherwise be processing. The second thing that happens is that when you're doing this exercise and you take deep breaths, so remember we talked about your parasympathetic system, which is responsible for calming an aroused state. So there was a CNS and an ANS. The ANS was your autonomic nervous system, and autonomic nervous system के अंदर आपका एक parasympathetic system है. And that is a system that is responsible for bringing you back to a state of calm. And so what that does is it gives your physical body the signal to stop tensing, to stop being hypervigilant, which is usually what happens when we've got too much on our mind. And that allows us to just sort of calm down and focus in on whatever it is that you, like you mentioned, recall something, right? Does that make sense? Got it?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Now, again, I bring you back to the last bit of consciousness, which is dreams, in which, unfortunately, I have to talk about Freud again. So Freud had this notion that there is latent content in our life. Again, latent content, which means that he thought that we have some layers within us that have a hidden meaning. And I can't stop smiling. But he thought and that there's a difference between the stuff that we consciously remember and act on, which is our manifest stuff, and then we have this hidden stuff, which is latent, right? And he would sort of say that, oh, you might something very Freudian might be that you are a pet owner and you have a dog, and that's your manifest content, your love for your dog. But like the hidden meaning of that love for your dog, the latent content is that you have a massive fear of death. I mean, actually, Freud did say that human beings are born with the death drive and the sex drive. Those were his two sort of founding principles. So yeah, I feel like that's something he might say. And according to him, then, when somebody has a dream, you have to analyze the dream to see what latent content is being brought up for them in that dream, right? And for Freud, the latent content was predominantly sexual. So if you had a dream about a cat, Freud might come back to you and tell you that, this is because you had feelings for your brother or your sister. But technically for Freud, he would say no. Actually, he would say that if you're a woman, he would tell you, oh, you had feelings for your father and you were jealous of your mother, and that's why you dreamt about a cat. So again, no science, no thought about logic, or let's call it false logic, logical fallacy. A better perspective is information processing, which looks at the brain as a computer. Essentially, it's got inputs, and then those inputs lead to certain processes. Those processes create outputs. And so when we dream, that is a process that is meant to help us consolidate our memory. But the thing that the information processing perspective does not consider is, what about, sometimes, very, very rarely, but sometimes you dream about things you have never experienced ever, and not about past events, right? Like sometimes you might have dreams which are some sort of amalgamation of many different events in your past, but sometimes you have dreams that are completely foreign and will blow you out of the water, literally, right? And then we talk about the physiological function of dreams, And the physiological function is fairly straightforward and scientifically viable-ish as well. When we are asleep in our random eye movement or REM sleep stage, so at that point, the function of a dream is for us to continue to work those, so sort of like brain exercise. Okay, so it's just important for us to dream so that we can work all of those muscles involved in visualization and thinking and language and communicating, etc. But sometimes we have dreams that are really meaningful, no? Like, have you ever had a dream that you've woken up from and been like, wow, that was really, lovely? Because sometimes maybe when you're sleeping, you see a relative who's passed away, who you were close to. So why do we have meaningful dreams then, right? Then there's an activation synthesis perspective, which is sort of a little bit similar to the physiological function. But in this one, it says that when you have that REM sleep and you have that neural activity, the reason we dream is basically that we take these random visuals that maybe we've seen somewhere on TV or on social media or in our life, in our past, in our childhood, and our brain just connects those visual memories into these narratives that we then see as dreams. So that would be an activation synthesis perspective, right? Activation meaning visual and memory networks are activated and then they come together and synthesize. Very simple. But again, the question that I had, and I'm sure you have it, and before you ask me, let me just tell you it is a real question and I don't have the answer. The question is, this narrative or this story that your dream tells, who is the narrator? Right? Like, yes, okay, memory is activated, visual memory is activated, okay. But what makes our dreams make sense? They may not make sense when you wake up, but when you're having the dream, all those random segues into different sort of scenarios and situations that can be part of a dream, those who is weaving those stories, right? And finally, of course, cognitive development, that when we are dreaming, the kinds of dreams we have, the content of the dreams, they reflect our cognitive development. So they reflect our stage of visualization and visual processing, what we've learned. And sometimes, dreams are a method of problem solving because they can simulate real life scenarios, etc., etc. But there is no, there's no real value then to a dream, right? Like, in this perspective, if all it does is tell us what level of cognitive development we're at, what's the adaptive value, right? How do dreams help us survive the world or adapt to the environment? Because remember, at the end of the day, whatever the issues are within evolutionary psychology are separate, but it is true that for us to survive in this world, we need to be agile and we need to adapt. Small example, air conditioners, global warming. Cheaper air conditioners, more global warming, but we're still surviving, right? We're not getting heat stroke and dying. Well, some of us, unfortunately, are, but we're adapting to the demands of our environment just to survive. So remember that. Do you have any questions? No? Excellent.
Hello, Miss.
Wait, this
Hello.
is also why we use grounding techniques for anxiety to weed out overwhelming. Yeah, I think maybe you said this when I was talking about meditation, mindfulness. So yeah, you're right. The specific concept of latent content only specific to dreams. For Freud, I would say no, because everything to him had a deeper hidden content. So his thing was that in our life, in our everyday life, we have manifest content and latent content. It's not just in our dreams, right? Because the latent content is completely part of the unconscious, the Freudian unconscious, which scientifically speaking, nobody knows if it exists. All right, Aisha, go ahead.
Okay, so Miss, basically, I want to ask. It happens sometimes that when we are dreaming, so we do have scenarios that are happening around us in real life, but we are asleep and we are having the same scenario in our mind. So, what kind of cognition or what kind of visualization is that? My first question is this, and the second thing is that there are different kinds of dreams. Some are meaningful, some are not, but we are not really able to differentiate between them, and we often do make sense of dreams that are not really necessary. So, is there a way to find that out or anything like according to research?
Okay, you're asking me two really big questions. So let me just answer the first one, and I'm gonna have to ask you to repeat the second one because I lost you a little bit. So if I'm not mistaken, you asked me, ke, where would you bracket dreams to be then? Would you talk about it as wish fulfillment according to Freud, or would you put it in information processing or activation synthesis, or simply reduce it to its physiological function? Unfortunately, because dream research is just so controversial and dreams are so diverse and varied, there are still no conclusive, um, there's nothing conclusive as a hypothesis that has been tested and is true completely and answers all our questions about dreams, right? So that's the first thing you asked me. And the second thing you asked me was,
It was like people often believe that whatever they dream, they kind of try to create a link and assume it to be their gut feeling at times. And like some dreams are meaningful while some are not. So like how can we exactly distinguish what kind of dreams do we have, and if we are supposed to make sense of it, and if it is applicable in real life or not?
I can't tell you how to look at your dreams, my friend. It depends. I don't value my dreams. I think they're fun adventures, at best, into the vast depths of whatever's in here. But I can't tell you whether, a lot of people, I mean, look, culturally speaking, a lot of religions value particular types of dreams. Dreams have a large part in the narratives of many different religions. Okay. In fact, for us, though, there's a big lie about Iqbal seeing Pakistan in a dream, which is the grandest lie that has ever been told. Um, so dreams are so I don't know how to, they're so fuzzy, right? Like, how do you separate all the cultural and the social connotations of dreams from the individual's valuation of a dream? Like I told you, I think dreams are just fun, at best, and nightmares are traumatic at worst, and I don't know where they come from. But the science on it is really fuzzy. Some people would suggest कि आपके जो dreams होते हैं, if you have a Jungian perspective and you believe in the collective unconscious. Do you remember I talked to you about collective unconscious and archetypes? So some people might say that in your dreams you just see the archetypes, which is why sometimes you dream about things you've never seen before or experienced before, which is a really beautiful perspective, and I feel inspired to write a short story about it, but I don't know if it's real, right? Um, and so I can't necessarily tell you, Kiji, this is how you would understand or make sense of any kind of dream. Because a large part of what you dream must have to come from who you are and what your lived experience has been. Absolutely, I think. But then people all over the world report, certain commonly occurring dreams, right? So falling is a very common dream that's been reported. But then, I mean, why is that? Why do so many people have dreams about falling, or why do so many people have dreams about being chased, right? And so you have to, it's hard for me honestly to give you like a yes, this is what it is answer, but I can give you more questions to think about why there is no conclusive answer to dream analysis. um, So whether you dream about something and then it happens, I mean, it's whatever you want to call it, really. You know, it's very, very, very subjective. So yeah. So this question that sometimes we wake up right when we start to dream, that could be because of something that has changed in the environment around you that has caused you to wake up. Or maybe the move into REM sleep has been so sharp that you are just jerked awake instead. That's what happens when you wake up. I am not a dream analysis expert, so I'm going to stop now. All right, so we're done now. We're going to finish sensation and perception on Laiba. You have a question?
Hello, Miss, can you hear me?
I can hear you. You're just going to have to be a little bit louder, please.
Yeah, so I'm sorry, this is my mic. Okay, so Miss, my question is that I don't know. It's about basically dreams. People can control their dreams. So what's that concept basically? What do you think? I mean, psychology. What psychology says about it?
About lucid dreams?
No, controlling the dreams.
That is a lucid dream, Bache. A lucid
Yes,
dream
yes.
is about being semi-awake so that you can control your dreams. So a lot of people have claimed to be able to do this, and what I can tell you, and I would have to do further research on this, but what I can tell you is that initially this was completely disregarded. कैसे हो ही नहीं सकता है? It's not possible, right? But now I think they are starting to explore the possibilities of what the processes are that enable people to maintain some level of awake awareness, if that's even possible during a sleep state. So again, the research is just sort of starting to happen, and it's very spotty. It's very spotty, so it's there needs to be a lot more done before we can say with certainty that this is possible and actual, and it's a phenomena that's explained by this or by that. Same goes to sleep paralysis. It's something I experienced personally as well, but I don't know where within psychology would sleep paralysis be located. To my mind, it is, and the biological sort of explanations for sleep paralysis are that it's some sort of like overload in your breathing and your heart rate. So that could be a very realistic solution as well. And everybody dreams, you just are not able to remember your dreams, which is a really, really interesting part of consciousness during sleep. Because you see, we talk about consciousness as, something that also implies a memory of something, right? But when you dream, it's during a state of lowered consciousness, right? But you're still conscious during sleep, but you don't remember all of your dreams. So it's a really interesting thing, and I think maybe I don't know if we'll ever have the answers. I mean, I don't think in my lifetime we will, but maybe in yours you will find the answers to these questions. But I can tell you that 10 years ago, the only thing we would learn about dreams in college was that this is what Freud said and it's nonsense. So, at least you came this far. So, feel free to do your own research on this. Anything else? All right, guys. I will see you on Wednesday. Your quiz is on the 29th of March, so week after next. And so you will cover developmental psych, you will talk about sensation, perception, consciousness, etc. There will be a scenario-based MCQ section, which will be hard, so get ready for that. Second, your quiz marks, some of you have done really well, like 15 on 16, very good job. be prepared to have a more challenging assessment now that you've had some time to get used to it. And I will see you on Wednesday in person. If you want to join online, join online. That is it. Bye-bye. See you. Have a good week. Happy Monday.